A lone car speeds down Interstate 5, headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver, a young woman, is completely unaware that she's being watched. From a distance, a predator follows, his eyes locked on her every move. He waits for the right moment, for her car to break down, for her to stop for gas, for the perfect opportunity to strike. Over the course of a decade, multiple women vanished along I-5. Their bodies were later found dumped in remote locations, their clothing mutilated, their lives stolen by a mysterious strangler. For years, the killer operated in the shadows. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no survivors. Authorities had no suspect, no forensic evidence, no clear pattern, just a growing number of young women disappearing. The media dubbed him the I-5 Strangler, a name that haunted Northern California, and for years, he remained a ghost. But in 1991, investigators finally uncovered the truth behind the I-5 Strangler's reign of terror. The killer wasn't some nameless drifter. He wasn't a fugitive hiding in the shadows. His name was Roger Kibbe, a husband, a father, and a small business owner. What drove him to stalk, abduct, and strangle innocent women? And how did he evade police for more than a decade? This is the terrifying story of the I-5 Strangler. Kibbe's early life and first signs of darkness. Roger Reese Kibbe was born on May 21, 1939, in California. To the outside world, he was an ordinary child, quiet, distant, and often lost in his own thoughts. But those who knew him best noticed something strange about him. Unlike other boys his age, Kibbe had no interest in sports, friendships, or normal childhood activities. Instead, he developed an unusual obsession with fabric. As a child, he would steal pieces of women's clothing and meticulously cut them into strange shapes and patterns. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an odd hobby, but over time, it became a disturbing ritual, one that gave him a sense of control. By the time he was a teenager, his desires had escalated. He started breaking into homes, stealing women's lingerie, and keeping them as trophies. For most, these behaviors would be warning signs, clear indications of a deeply troubled mind. But Kibbe managed to blend in. He graduated high school, got married, and seemed to live a normal life. He started a small home remodeling business, which gave him an air of respectability. To everyone around him, he was just another working man. But inside, his twisted desires were still there, festering, growing stronger. And soon his obsession with control and domination would evolve into something far worse. His first murder. It was September 1977 when Roger Kibbe took his first known life. Her name was Lou Ellen Burley, a 21-year-old woman from Walnut Creek, California. She had been looking for work when she was approached by a man who offered her a job opportunity. He seemed polite, professional, even trustworthy, but she had no idea she had just walked into the hands of a predator. Kibbe lured her to a secluded area where he bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled her to death. Unlike his later victims, Burley's body was never found, at least not for decades. For years, her disappearance remained a mystery. There were no signs of struggle, no immediate suspects, and no clues that pointed to what had happened to her. And that was exactly how Kibbe wanted it. For years, he refined his methods, learning how to cover his tracks, how to dispose of bodies, how to leave nothing behind. It wouldn't be until 2011, more than 3 decades later, that Burley's remains would finally be discovered, thanks to a confession from Kibbe himself. But at the time, in 1977, Kibbe had just learned something terrifying. He could kill and get away with it. And so, his reign as the I-5 Strangler had begun. The killing spree. Years of fear on California's highways. For nearly a decade, Roger Kibbe hunted along Interstate 5, turning the highway into his personal killing ground. His victims were young women, often hitchhikers, runaways, or those stranded along the road. They had no idea they were being watched until it was too late. One of his victims, Laura Rena Hedick, 20, was last seen in Sacramento in April 1986. Her strangled body was discovered months later, dumped in a field near the freeway. Another victim, Barbara Ann Scott, 29, was found in July 1986 beneath a tree at a golf course in Antioch, California. She had been strangled, her body left posed in an eerie display. The pattern was unmistakable. By the end of 1986, Kibbe had claimed at least 4 more lives. Stephanie Brown, 19, found in a drainage ditch. Charmaine Sabra, 26, last seen accepting a ride before her body was found in a remote area. Catherine Quinones, 25, found dumped near Lake Berryessa, a location eerily close to where his first victim, Lou Ellen Burley, had vanished nearly a decade earlier. Each victim was strangled, their clothing cut with precise, deliberate patterns, one of Kibbe's disturbing trademarks. Unlike most serial killers, Kibbe didn't just kill. He ritualistically altered his victims' clothing, cutting away pieces in bizarre geometric shapes. It was a compulsion, a sinister act of control that set him apart from other killers. But despite his growing body count, police still had no suspect. The I-5 Strangler was a phantom, a predator who seemed to vanish without a trace after each kill. But even the most careful killers make mistakes. And in 1987, Kibbe finally slipped up, leaving behind something that investigators would later use to bring his killing spree to an end. The mistake that led to his arrest. For years, Roger Kibbe had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement. He was careful, methodical, and patient. He left no fingerprints, no clear DNA evidence, and no living witnesses. But in September 1987, he made a mistake. The body of Darcy Frackenpole, 17, a Seattle runaway last seen in Sacramento, was discovered near Echo Summit, just off Highway 50. Like his other victims, she had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and left partially undressed. Her clothing, like the others, had been cut in a precise, deliberate pattern. But this time, investigators found something that changed everything. Fibers from a distinctive parachute cord near the body. The cut patterns in her clothing matched those of previous unsolved cases. Authorities were starting to see the pattern, but they still had no name, no face. That changed later in 1987, when Kibbe attempted to kidnap a sex worker named Deborah Ann Guffey. He tried to handcuff her inside his car, but she fought back, screamed, and escaped. A nearby police officer intervened, and Kibbe was arrested for assault and false imprisonment. Though the charges seemed minor, detectives started connecting the dots. By 1991, forensic experts had matched the parachute cord from Frackenpole's murder to Kibbe's possession. This rare cord was only used in specific types of parachute rigging, something Kibbe was known to have. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Police arrested Kibbe in 1991 and charged him with Frackenpole's murder. During questioning, Kibbe showed no emotion, as if being accused of murder didn't faze him at all. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence, Kibbe knew he was caught. Rather than risk a death sentence, he pleaded guilty to Frackenpole's murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. At the time, authorities suspected he was responsible for more murders. But without direct evidence, they couldn't charge him. For nearly 2 decades, it seemed like his full body count would remain a mystery. But then, in 2003, a new forensic breakthrough would finally expose the full extent of Kibbe's crimes. The full truth uncovered, connecting the cold cases. For nearly 2 decades, Roger Kibbe sat in prison, serving his sentence for the murder of Darcy Frackenpole. But law enforcement never stopped investigating him. They knew Frackenpole wasn't his only victim, but with no DNA evidence at the time, they couldn't prove it. Then, in 2003, that all changed. California's DNA backlog testing program reopened several cold cases linked to the I-5 Strangler. New forensic technology allowed experts to reanalyze evidence from crime scenes, specifically fibers, ligature marks, and biological material that had once been undetectable. One by one, the connections became undeniable. By 2008, DNA evidence officially linked Kibbe to 6 additional murders. Lou Ellen Burley, 21, missing since 1977, body recovered in 2011. Laura Hedick, 20, April 1986, body found months later. Barbara Ann Scott, 29, found in July 1986, strangled. Stephanie Brown, 19, found dumped in a drainage ditch. Charmaine Sabra, 26, vanished after accepting a ride, later discovered strangled. Catherine Quinones, 25, her body found near Lake Berryessa. Each victim had the same signature: parachute cord ligature marks, sexual assault, and clothing cut in precise patterns. Kibbe had refined his technique over the years, but in the end, science caught up to him. Faced with undeniable DNA evidence, Kibbe finally confessed. In 2009, he pleaded guilty to 6 more murders, receiving 6 consecutive life sentences without parole. This meant Kibbe would never walk free again. With his confession, authorities finally closed multiple cold cases, bringing long overdue justice to the families of his victims. But his story wasn't over yet, because even behind bars, Kibbe's past would soon catch up to him. The unbelievable ending. What happened in prison? For over a decade, Roger Kibbe sat behind bars at Mule Creek State Prison, living out the remainder of his multiple life sentences. His days of stalking highways and hunting for victims were long over. At 81 years old, Kibbe had become just another aging inmate, his once feared name fading into obscurity. But on February 28, 2021, his past caught up to him in the most unexpected way. That morning, during a routine check, prison guards found Kibbe unresponsive in his cell. He had been strangled to death. His cellmate, Jason Boudreaux, a convicted murderer, was standing nearby, calmly waiting for the guards to arrive. Boudreaux later confessed to killing Kibbe, claiming it was prison justice, an act of revenge for the innocent women Kibbe had murdered. An autopsy confirmed what was immediately clear. Kibbe died the same way his victims did, strangled, left lifeless, with no one to save him. For many, his death was poetic justice. For years, Kibbe had stolen lives without remorse, leaving behind a trail of pain and unanswered questions. And while his death brought a sense of closure, it also left one final mystery. Were there more victims? Kibbe never revealed his true body count, and with him dead, we may never know the full truth. His reign as the I-5 Strangler was finally over. But the ghosts of his crimes still linger, and for the families of his victims, the pain he caused will never truly disappear.